Summer wasn't the kind of child who needed constant attention. She moved through the house like a small sunbeam, here for a moment, gone for another, always leaving behind a trace of warmth. Rick would watch her sometimes from the garage doorway, a wrench in one hand, pretending he wasn't watching at all. Her world was still mostly earthbound then. Sandboxes, bikes, the smell of rain on pavement. But already there was something in her eyes that didn't quite match the neighborhood. She had the look of someone who suspected the sky had seams, and if you pushed hard enough, they might come apart to show what was really out there. They didn't talk much in those early years. Rick didn't explain his machines to her, and she didn't ask about the flasks on his workbench, but she did stand close enough to hear the hum of his experiments, the sound of impossible things taking shape in a quiet garage, and every so often he'd leave a little something where she'd find it, a marble that glowed faintly in the dark, a pocket mirror that showed you a second reflection, slightly delayed, as if the person in the glass was thinking about whether to follow your movements. She never asked where they came from. She simply kept them in a shoebox under her bed, as if collecting fragments of a story she wasn't ready to read yet. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she'd take the glowing marble outside at night. She'd hold it up to the stars, her face still and wondering. Rick saw her once from the kitchen window. He almost went out there, almost told her about the kind of star systems where light like that was common. But instead he stayed where he was, letting her keep her own version of the truth. Because some truths, he knew, were better left soft and unshaped, like clouds drifting in the mind. One afternoon, when the sky was a pale, sleepy blue, Summer came into the garage and asked, "Do you ever get lonely?" Rick didn't answer right away. He tightened a bolt on a strange-looking cylinder, wiped his hands, and finally said, "Sometimes the loneliest people are the ones who don't look like it." She didn't reply, but something in her expression shifted, like she'd filed that sentence away for later. It was the first time Rick felt the faint echo of something in her, a recognition, like she was learning to read between the lines the same way he did. The days that followed passed quietly. Morty was his usual whirlwind of nervous questions. Beth was busy. Jerry was Jerry. But Summer had begun spending more time near the garage. Not inside, not asking to help, just near. She'd sit on the porch, tying knots in bits of string, or draw circles in chalk on the driveway. Rick liked to think she was making her own kind of map, even if she didn't know it yet. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Rick went out to the porch and found one of her chalk circles still faintly visible. In the center was the glowing marble. It pulsed gently, like a sleeping heartbeat. He picked it up, held it in his palm for a moment, and then put it back, exactly where she'd left it. He didn't know why, maybe because it felt like something sacred, and in his own strange, tired way, he wanted her to have something that would always belong only to her. And in the quiet of that late hour, he thought about the other summers, the ones he hadn't been able to keep. But he didn't stay there long. The night had a way of folding such thoughts back into itself, like waves smoothing the sand. It began with a dream Rick didn't mean to have. He wasn't asleep so much as drifting, the way you do in the soft hours after midnight, when the air feels heavy and the walls seem farther away. In the dream, Summer was standing in a place he didn't recognize. The sky above her was a faded lavender, and the ground beneath her feet shimmered like glass. She was smiling, but there was a kind of sadness threaded through it, like a song you almost know but can't sing along to. When he woke, the garage lights were still on, his tools scattered. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, staring at nothing, letting the fading details of the dream soak into him like rain into dry soil. It wasn't the first time he'd seen her like that, and he knew, in that quiet, reluctant way he knew certain things, that it wasn't this summer he was dreaming about. It was the other one. The next morning, he didn't say a word about it, but Summer must have felt something in the air. She moved a little slower, looked at him a little longer, like she was trying to hear the spaces between his words. They sat on the back steps that evening, neither of them speaking. The cicadas sang softly from the trees. She picked up the marble again, rolling it between her fingers, the light from it painting her skin in faint, moving colours. "Do you ever think there's another me somewhere?" she asked suddenly. Rick glanced at her, but didn't answer right away. The truth was too big for that moment. Finally, he said, "There's always another version of you, but the one in front of you is the only one you get to keep." She nodded like she understood, though her eyes stayed on the marble. Later that week, they took one of Rick's quieter trips. No screaming aliens, no collapsing timelines. Just a planet of endless grass, where the wind played the hills like an instrument. Summer lay down in it, eyes closed, letting the sound surround her. Rick sat nearby, watching the sky turn gold. The sun there set in slow motion, so that evenings stretched on for what felt like forever. He thought about telling her then, about the summer he couldn't save, but the words stayed locked in the back of his throat. Some truths he'd learned were like delicate glass. You didn't hand them to someone unless you were ready to see them break. When they came home, the chalk circles were gone, washed away by rain. Summer didn't seem to mind. She started drawing new ones, different shapes this time, with lines connecting them, almost like constellations. And though she never said it out loud, Rick knew she was making a map of something she didn't fully understand yet. That night, when the house was quiet, he stood in the doorway of her room. The marble was on her nightstand, glowing faintly beside a small notebook she'd left open. Inside, she'd drawn the same lavender sky he'd seen in his dream, and even though he didn't remember telling her about it, somehow she'd known. Rick had always believed the mind kept its own archives, dusty corridors filled with moments you didn't ask to remember. But lately those corridors felt rearranged. Some doors led to memories that had never happened in this timeline. Others opened into dreams so gentle they hurt. It was the lavender sky again this time. He wasn't sleeping. He was in the garage, adjusting a calibration node, when his hand simply stopped. The hum of the machinery became a different sound, softer, rounder, and when he looked up, the walls were gone. The air smelled like warm rain. And there she was, Summer, her hair moving in a breeze that didn't belong to Earth. She said something, but the words were carried away before they reached him, like they'd been spoken underwater. When he blinked, the garage was back. The rest of that day moved like it was wrapped in cotton. He barely heard Morty's frantic retelling of some school disaster, barely noticed Beth asking if he was doing all right. But Summer noticed. She didn't press him, she never pressed, but she lingered a little longer in the doorway when she passed. Rick almost told her. Almost. That night, he found her outside on the porch, tracing her chalk lines by the light of the street lamp. It had rained again, so the shapes were half faded, the edges smudged into strange new forms. She didn't seem to mind. Her hands were dusted in pale blue, her expression somewhere between focus and daydream. When she saw him, she said, "It's okay if they wash away. It just means I get to start again." He sat down beside her, not sure if she was talking about the chalk or something else entirely. They watched the sky for a while. The stars were sharp that night, and he found himself pointing out constellations, not the official ones, but the ones he'd made up during lonely travels. She listened, nodding, as if she could see each one exactly as he described it. Somewhere in the middle of it, she leaned her head against his shoulder. It was such a small thing, but it stayed with him long after she went inside. Later, alone in the garage, Rick opened one of his storage drawers and took out a device the size of a coin. It was nothing dangerous, just something he'd built a long time ago to store a single sensory moment, the smell of a place, the color of a sky, the feel of air in a certain world. Without thinking too much about it, he pressed the button. A tiny holographic shimmer rose, and there it was, the lavender sky, exactly as he'd dreamed it, exactly as she'd drawn it in her notebook. He stood there for a long time, the hum of the garage low and steady. In the holographic light, he could almost believe she was standing there too. Not this Summer, but the other one, the one who still looked at him with the same mixture of trust and quiet wonder. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he whispered into the empty room, "I'm still here." The morning was pale and weightless, the kind where the sun feels reluctant to climb past the rooftops. Summer sat at the kitchen table, turning her spoon slowly in a bowl she wasn't eating from. Rick poured coffee, the sound of it filling the air more than either of their voices. It was one of those silences that didn't need fixing, the kind that had its own steady heartbeat. "You've been somewhere lately," she said finally, not looking up. Rick took a sip, stared at the steam curling from his mug. Garage mostly, he said, as if that answered everything. She gave a small shrug like she knew better than to push, but the thought stayed in her eyes. Later, she wandered out to the garage while he was pretending to work. Her hair was still damp from a shower, carrying that faint, clean scent that always made him think of rain on warm pavement. She didn't say anything, just sat on the old stool in the corner, swinging one foot gently back and forth. For a long while he kept his eyes on the workbench, adjusting a screw here, swapping a wire there, but the feeling of her gaze was like a slow tide. It couldn't be ignored forever. "Ever feel like you're missing a piece of yourself?" she asked quietly. Rick set the screwdriver down. His first thought was to deflect, to make some sarcastic remark about the human condition or the pointlessness of self-reflection. But her tone stopped him. It wasn't a question asked for answers. It was a question asked to see if he'd meet her in the space it created. "Yeah," he said finally. "Sometimes it's not a missing piece. Sometimes it's one you used to have, but it belonged to another version of you." Summer tilted her head slightly, as if filing that away with all the other half-explanations he'd given her over the years. She didn't press him, but she stayed on the stool until his hand stilled and the hum of the machinery softened. That evening, they took a slow walk down the street. The summer air, the season, not the girl, was warm enough to carry the smell of honeysuckle from a neighbour's yard. Summer pointed to the sky, where a faint, pale moon hung low. "It doesn't look real tonight," she murmured. Rick followed her gaze. "Most of the real things don't," he said. When they got home, she went straight to her room. Rick lingered in the hallway for a moment, listening to the faint scratch of a pencil. Later, after the house had gone quiet, he passed by again. Her door was cracked open. Inside, she had drawn the moon, but not the one from their street. This one was too large, too close, with a lavender sky behind it. He didn't go in, he didn't take the drawing, but he knew. Somehow, she was already walking toward the same horizon he'd been standing at for years. The day began without urgency. Summer was reading on the couch, legs tucked under a blanket even though the air was warm. Rick came in from the garage, smelling faintly of solder and engine oil, and without a word held out a small metallic ring. "Want to go somewhere quiet?" he asked. She didn't ask where. She never did. Instead, she set the blanket aside, slipped on her shoes, and followed him out to the driveway where the portal shimmered, not the usual sharp green, but a muted silver, as if it already knew this trip wasn't for chaos. They stepped through into a place that felt immediately like a deep breath. The ground was covered in pale grass that bent like silk underfoot. A wide river moved slowly in the distance, its surface reflecting the sky in strange, shifting colors. It wasn't lavender this time, but a faded gold, the kind that makes you think of old photographs. Rick didn't speak for a long while, and neither did Summer. They just walked until the sounds of their own world were far behind them. Every so often, a bird-like shape drifted overhead, its wings catching the light in ripples. Summer tilted her head back to follow their path, smiling faintly, as if she could hear something in their flight. Eventually they reached the riverbank. Rick sat down, pulling his knees up, watching the water curve and fold around smooth stones. Summer sat beside him, close enough for their shoulders to brush. "You bring anyone else here?" she asked. "No," he said simply. The silence between them was different here, fuller somehow, as if the place itself was listening. Summer picked up a pebble and rolled it between her fingers. "I think this would be a good place to remember things," she said softly. Rick glanced at her, his mouth opening just slightly before closing again. She didn't look at him, but she smiled, as though she'd felt the weight of the words he almost spoke. They stayed there until the light shifted and the river took on the color of warm tea. When they finally stepped back through the portal into the driveway, it was nearly dark in their own world. Summer went inside first, heading for her room without a backward glance, but Rick noticed the small, pale pebble now resting in her palm. Later that night, he passed her door. It was closed, but faint light seeped through the bottom, and he could hear the quiet scratch of pencil on paper. Somewhere inside, she was drawing again. He imagined the river's curve, the faded gold sky, the birds with ripple wings, and, maybe, somewhere in the corner of the page, she'd draw him too. Rick returned to the garage, sat at his bench, and placed an identical pebble on the shelf above his tools. Not because he needed it, but because it was the kind of thing you kept when you didn't want to forget how a day had felt. It was a few days before Rick saw the drawing. Summer had left her notebook open on the coffee table, half covered by a folded blanket. He wasn't looking for it, just moving the blanket aside. But the page caught him like a quiet voice in a crowded room. It was the river. Not just any river, but that river. The slow curve of water, the golden sky leaning toward dusk, even the faint suggestion of birds whose wings shimmered in ripples. She'd drawn it exactly as it had been, down to the pattern of stones at the bend. Except there was something else. A figure on the far bank, small but distinct, standing in the shadow of a tree. Rick closed the notebook without a sound. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of memory, a coincidence in her mind. But the image stayed lodged in him like a splinter. That evening, Summer found him in the garage. She leaned in the doorway, arms folded loosely. "You keep things you don't use anymore," she said. Rick looked up from the workbench. "Yeah, that's called being sentimental, kid." She gave a half smile as though that word had landed somewhere she'd remember later. On the far wall, the shelf with the pebble sat in the shadows. Summer's eyes flicked toward it, then back to him, but she didn't ask about it. Instead, she wandered over to the tool rack, running her fingers lightly along the handles as if each one carried a story she couldn't quite hear. "Do you ever see something before you actually see it?" she asked suddenly. Rick's hand tightened around the wrench he was holding. He thought about the lavender sky, about the moon she'd drawn before he'd told her, about the figure on the riverbank. "Sometimes," he said. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "No," he lied. The next morning, the notebook was gone from the coffee table. She kept it in her room now, tucked away under a stack of other books. But occasionally, when Rick passed her doorway, he'd see her sitting cross-legged on the bed, drawing with a kind of quiet urgency, as though she were trying to catch something before it slipped away. One night, unable to resist, he built a small lens that could pick up the faint residue of image impressions through paper. He told himself it was just curiosity. But when he tested it on the closed notebook, the outline that shimmered faintly on the surface wasn't of any place he'd shown her. It was a fragment of somewhere else, and in the center of it, she was standing, older, maybe, or simply lit in a way that made her feel like someone he'd already lost. Rick put the lens away, switching off the garage light. In the darkness, he thought of all the Summers scattered across the multiverse, the ones who had never seen this earth, never sat at this kitchen table, never drawn these skies. And he wondered, not for the first time, if the one in this house had begun to remember something he'd tried not to. The rain had been falling since morning, a steady whisper against the windows. It softened the whole house, made the air feel closer. Summer was in the kitchen, a mug of tea cooling beside her, her notebook open in front of her. Rick came in for coffee, his hair slightly damp from the walk between the garage and the house. She didn't close the notebook this time. "Do you know this place?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. Rick set the mug down, letting his gaze drop to the page. It was the lavender sky again, stretched wide, fading into a pale horizon. The same glassy ground from his dreams, the same strange light that made everything feel weightless. And in the middle of it, a lone figure walking away, their shadow trailing longer than seemed possible. He stared at it for a few seconds too long. "You've got a good imagination," he said finally. Summer tilted her head. "I don't think I made it up," she murmured. Rick picked up his mug, the smell of coffee rising between them. He could have told her, could have said the name of that place, could have explained why it lived at the edge of his mind like a song he refused to hum. But instead he just asked, "Do you dream it?" She nodded. "Not every night, but when I do, it feels like I've been there before, like I'm walking back into a room I left a long time ago." Her voice was soft, not searching for answers, just laying the truth down between them like a stone on a path. Rick sipped his coffee, the warmth pooling in his chest. He knew that feeling. He'd lived inside it for years. "Some dreams are just memories with the volume turned down," he said. She gave him a small smile, as though she understood, though they both knew there were layers to that sentence she hadn't unwrapped yet. That afternoon, the rain stopped. The driveway steamed faintly in the late light, and Summer sat outside with her notebook, sketching slow lines as if she were tracing the air. Rick watched from the garage, tools forgotten in his hands. He realized he wasn't afraid of her remembering anymore, maybe because part of him wanted to see what else she might draw, what else she might find that he thought was gone. And as the sky dimmed, she looked up from the page and met his eyes across the yard. No words passed between them, but it felt in that stillness like they'd both agreed to carry something together, even if neither of them had said it out loud. It was early afternoon when Rick appeared in the kitchen, portal gun in hand. Summer was leaning on the counter, eating an apple, her notebook closed beside her. "Feel like getting some fresh air?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, they stepped through a muted green shimmer and onto ground that felt almost familiar. The air here was warmer than home, thick with the scent of something sweet, like honey caught in sunlight. Far ahead, a slope rolled down toward a broad, open plain, and beyond that, the sky. Summer stopped walking. Her eyes widened just slightly, but she didn't speak. It was the same sky from one of her drawings, not lavender this time, but brushed with a pale, pearly glow. The horizon curved more than Earth's did, giving the world a gentle, sheltering feel. Rick pretended to check his wrist device, but he was watching her out of the corner of his eye. She walked forward slowly, her hand brushing against the tall grass, eyes scanning the distance as though searching for something she knew should be there. They reached a shallow ridge, and she crouched down, touching the soil. "It's warm," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Rick didn't answer. He was remembering another trip, another summer kneeling in the same place, smiling at something he hadn't understood until much later. Summer stood again, her gaze drifting toward a cluster of smooth stones at the base of the ridge. She walked to them, pausing before a larger one in the center. There was nothing remarkable about it, no markings, no glow, but she reached out and laid her palm flat against its surface. Then she closed her eyes. For a long moment they stood in silence, the only sound the wind moving through the grass. When she opened her eyes again, she looked straight at Rick. "I've been here before," she said simply. He could have asked her how she knew or pressed for details, but instead he just nodded. Sometimes acknowledgement was more important than explanation. They stayed there until the light began to fade, casting long, gentle shadows across the plain. When they stepped back through the portal into the driveway, Summer didn't go inside right away. She stood under the dim porch light, looking down at her hands. After a moment, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when you've confirmed something only your heart could explain. Rick watched her from the garage, the hum of his machines low in the background. She didn't need to tell him what she'd felt out there, and he didn't need to admit that he'd brought her just to see if the past could find her again. The garage was dark, except for the faint blue light of a monitor left on. Rick sat hunched in his chair, head tipped back, sleep finally pulling him under. He was standing in that same endless plain again, the one from earlier that day. But the light was different now, sharper, carrying a strange clarity. The grass was still, and there was no wind, no movement at all except for her. Summer, or rather the other Summer, stood a few steps ahead, facing away from him. Her hair moved as though there was a breeze only she could feel. When she turned, her eyes caught the light in a way that made them almost too bright to look at. "You're late," she said. Her voice was the same as the Summer he knew, but steadier, older somehow. Rick tried to speak, but nothing came out. The silence between them was wide and heavy. Finally, she stepped closer. "You have to remember what I told you," she said. The words were slow, deliberate, as if each one had to find its way through layers of time. Rick frowned. "What did you tell me?" But she only shook her head. Then she leaned in, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath against his ear. "Not everything you saved stayed with you." When he blinked, she was gone. The plain stretched empty in all directions, the sky dimming toward an unfamiliar dusk. Rick woke with a start, the chair creaking under him. The garage smelled faintly of solder and coffee. His hands were clenched tight around the arms of the chair, and the words were still in his ears. "Not everything you saved stayed with you." For a long while he sat there, staring at nothing, He could have grabbed a drink or gone back to work, but instead he just sat in the stillness, listening to the quiet hum of the machines. It was the first time in a long while that he didn't want to tinker with anything. Some things he knew couldn't be fixed, only carried. The sun was just beginning to stretch its light across the kitchen, soft and pale. Summer sat at the table, pencil in hand, notebook open. Rick came in with a mug of coffee, hair messy, eyes heavy, still carrying the residue of last night's dream. He placed the mug down, avoiding her gaze. But Summer didn't need words. She didn't ask him what was wrong. Instead, she tilted the notebook so he could see the page. It was the lavender sky again, pale and endless. But this time, a figure walked along a riverbank, faint and distant. He recognized it immediately, the posture, the tilt of the head, the slow, certain pace. It was her, but not the Summer sitting across from him. The other one. Rick swallowed. He didn't need to say anything. She didn't expect him to. Her hand moved across the page, soft lines tracing stones, water, the curve of the horizon. It was quiet work, deliberate, as though she were remembering a song she had only ever hummed in fragments. He watched for a long moment, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of utensils filling the space between them. Then she looked up, just for a second, and smiled. A small, knowing smile, like she had already understood something he hadn't dared admit. Rick took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. He didn't comment. He didn't question. Some things didn't need explanation. Some things just were. Later he went to the garage and left a small lens on the workbench, the one he used to see residual impressions on paper. Not to check her drawing, not to prove anything, just to remind himself that some things could be held gently without needing to be captured or fixed. And somewhere, in the quiet of the morning light, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this Summer, the one who sat quietly and drew skies she didn't remember visiting, could carry both versions of herself. And maybe he could let go of the rest, even for a moment. The sky was the color of softened charcoal, deepening with the approach of night. Summer sat on the porch steps, knees drawn close, hands resting lightly on them. Rick leaned back in his chair beside her, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Neither of them spoke for a while. The quiet stretched between them, the kind that held both presence and space, like a ribbon you could fold without tearing. Occasionally a bird's call echoed from the treetops, fading quickly into the dark. "You think the stars ever notice us?" Summer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rick didn't answer at first. He let his eyes follow a single pale star, lingering at the edge of the horizon. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe they do. But if they do, they're patient. They wait." Summer smiled faintly. She traced a finger along the edge of the porch as if mapping the space between herself and the vast sky above. "Kinda like you," she said, looking at him. Rick raised an eyebrow, but she didn't clarify. It didn't need explaining. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the soft scent of honeysuckle and damp earth. Summer tilted her head, eyes half closed, letting the evening settle into her bones. Rick sipped his coffee, feeling the warmth spread in his chest, not from the drink, but from the quiet they shared. Somewhere in the distance, a faint hum, the sort of hum you could almost convince yourself was the universe breathing, floated across the neighborhood. He thought about the lavender skies, the rivers, the other summers, and he thought about this one, the one sitting beside him, tracing lines in the air that only she could see. Eventually Summer leaned back, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move. He didn't need to. They sat together as the darkness deepened, letting the stars appear one by one, like tiny lanterns hung in the sky for no reason at all. The night had no hurry, no expectation, just the gentle unfolding of quiet and soft wonder. And Rick thought, for the first time in a long while, that maybe some things, some people, were meant to be noticed, not fixed. Morning arrived slowly, spilling pale light across the kitchen floor. Summer sat cross-legged at the table, notebook open, pencil moving with gentle deliberation. The air smelled faintly of toast and coffee, warm and comforting. Rick entered with his own mug, hair still messy, eyes carrying the residue of late-night thought. He paused, watching her trace shapes across the page. They were not the skies or rivers from before, but smaller things. Stones, wind patterns, the curve of a single bird's wing. She drew them with the same quiet focus she always had, but now there was something more, a sense of seeing, of noticing what others often overlooked. Rick sipped his coffee, letting the silence wrap around him. It wasn't empty. It was full of small echoes, the soft scratch of pencil on paper, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint weight of a shared presence. "You ever notice how little things add up?" Summer asked without looking up. Rick blinked, then nodded slowly. "Sometimes the little things matter more than the big ones," he said. She smiled, just a small curve of her lips, and continued drawing. For a moment, Rick thought about the other Summers scattered across the multiverse, the ones who had never traced a wing or felt the curve of a stone in their hands. And he realized how remarkable it was that this one, this Summer, did. Later, when the day had grown warmer, she placed the notebook on the counter, a stack of fresh drawings beneath it. Rick picked up one, tracing the lines with his finger. It was a sky, yes, but the clouds were different. Soft, looping shapes that reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. It was comforting. It was gentle. It was hers. He set it back down, watching her sip from her mug, letting the quiet settle around them. The room felt suspended in time, the kind of morning that seemed like it could last forever. And Rick thought, softly, that maybe connection didn't always need words. Sometimes it lived in small things, in drawings, in pauses, in the way someone could sit beside you and make the world feel wide and safe. The morning was tender, stretched thin by light, filtering through thin clouds. Summer had her notebook under her arm, a pencil tucked behind her ear, and a small smile she didn't bother to hide. Rick appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and the portal gun. No words were needed. A few moments later, they stepped through the familiar shimmer into a landscape that seemed spun from memory and ink. The ground was soft, dotted with tiny flowers that pulsed faintly when brushed by the wind. In the distance, hills curved lazily into the horizon, their edges smudged by mist. The sky was that pale lavender again, muted and weightless, as if it existed for no one in particular, yet welcomed them both. Summer wandered ahead, her fingers brushing the petals lightly. Rick followed, letting her set the pace, noticing the careful way she observed everything. She knelt by a small stream, tracing patterns in the water with a stick, watching ripples fan outward. "Look," she said, voice soft. "The world is like this sometimes. You just have to notice." Rick crouched beside her, peering into the water. The reflection of the sky wavered, breaking into fragments that caught the light. He said nothing. There was no need. The quiet held them together more, firmly than words ever could. They walked along the stream's edge, the grass brushing against their ankles, the soft hum of the wind threading around them. Occasionally, Summer would pause to draw shapes in the dirt or leave tiny stones in patterns, as though leaving small traces of herself behind. Rick watched silently, the thought coming to him that these small acts, quiet, deliberate, unnoticed, were as significant as anything he had ever accomplished across countless worlds. As the sun dipped lower, the lavender sky deepened, folding into soft purples and muted golds. Summer sat on a rock, notebook open again, sketching the hills and the rippling water. Rick leaned against a nearby tree, sipping his coffee, feeling the slow, steady pulse of the place seep into him. Somewhere between sleep and waking, dream and reality, he realized that he was witnessing something rare, a world made calm not by order, but by gentle presence. When they stepped back through the portal, the driveway was quiet. The sun had softened behind clouds, the shadows long and gentle. Summer went inside without a word, leaving her notebook on the table. Rick lingered a moment, tracing the faint outlines of her latest drawing, feeling the weight of small moments collected like fragile treasures. And somewhere, in the echo of that quiet landscape, he understood that some journeys were not about where you went, but how you noticed along the way. The house had grown quiet, the kind of quiet that holds you rather than empties the room. Summer sat on the couch with her notebook closed beside her. legs curled under her. The light from the street lamp spilled through the windows in long muted bars, touching the floor with warm amber. Rick leaned back in the armchair across from her, mug in hand, and let the silence stretch. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't lonely. It was deliberate, a shared pause after the day had carried them across worlds and memories. "You notice a lot," Rick said finally, his voice low and even. Summer looked at him, eyes reflecting the faint light. "I try," she said. "Sometimes noticing is all you can do." He nodded. It was the kind of answer that didn't need elaboration. He had learned over countless adventures that words often got in the way of understanding. Sometimes presence, quiet attention, and shared moments said more than explanation ever could. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, carrying the faint scent of evening rain and the soft hum of the world slowing down. Summer tilted her head back, listening, letting the sounds thread through her chest. Rick took a slow sip of his coffee, watching her, thinking about the other summers scattered across realities, and this one, here, right now, noticing the same things he had once only glimpsed alone. "Do you ever wonder if some things are meant to be remembered, even if you can't explain why?" she asked softly. Rick set his mug down. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes they come back anyway, even if you try to forget." Summer smiled faintly and leaned against the arm of the couch, eyes half closed. Rick watched the shadows stretch across the room, each one folding gently into the next. He thought of rivers, skies, and the lavender light of distant worlds, and he realized that maybe, just maybe, sharing these small things, noticing together, was its own kind of journey. Eventually Summer drifted to sleep, notebook resting on her lap. Rick stayed a little longer, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. Somewhere the multiverse hummed quietly, distant but familiar, and in the calm he understood that some days didn't need saving. Some days just needed to be noticed. The sun was just spilling through the blinds, painting soft lines across the kitchen floor. Summer sat at the table, notebook open, pencil moving slowly, almost like she was tracing the quiet heartbeat of the morning itself. Rick came in with a cup of coffee, hair still messy, eyes heavy with thoughts from the night before. He didn't speak. He just watched. Her hand traced shapes that seemed to fold into themselves, hills curving into rivers, clouds bending over skies, tiny stones resting where shadows fell. Each line felt deliberate, full of care, even when the forms were simple. Rick picked up one of the finished pages. It was not a place he recognized, not literally, but something about the patterns felt familiar. He traced a finger over the pencil lines, feeling the gentle flow of her attention. The curves mirrored something he had seen in his own dreams, something he had tried to name but couldn't. "You see things differently," he said softly. Summer didn't look up at first. "I just notice," she said after a moment, pencil pausing in midair. "Sometimes noticing is enough," she added. Rick nodded slowly, thinking of all the worlds he'd traversed, all the things he had tried to fix, change, or control. And here was Summer, noticing without judgment, seeing without interference. It was quiet, gentle, and profound. The kitchen was still except for the soft scratch of pencil on paper and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Rick took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread in his chest. He realized that some things, some people, carried a kind of magic in the way they simply paid attention. He had been too busy chasing stars and universes to see it before. Summer closed the notebook and leaned back, stretching her arms above her head. Rick watched her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The day felt endless, soft, like a river bending slowly toward something he didn't need to name. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that he could let the moment exist exactly as it was, quiet, unbroken, full of gentle wonder. The afternoon was warm but gentle, sunlight spilling across the yard in soft golden patches. Summer wandered ahead, notebook tucked under her arm, occasionally, bending to examine a leaf or pebble. Rick followed at a measured pace, hands in his pockets, listening to the faint hum of the neighborhood and the subtle movements of the air around them. They didn't speak much. Words felt unnecessary here. The quiet was full, alive with small things, the shimmer of a dewdrop, the way shadows stretched and curved over the grass, the distant trill of birds hidden in trees. At one point, Summer crouched beside a cluster of tiny flowers, tracing the edges of the petals with her fingers. "They're all different," she murmured. Rick nodded, crouching beside her. "Yes," he said softly, "even the ones that look the same at first glance." She smiled faintly, and for a moment he saw her not as the girl who tumbled through chaotic adventures, but as someone deeply attuned, someone capable of quiet reverence for the world, even the smallest pieces of it. They walked until the light shifted, softening further as the sun leaned toward the horizon. Summer paused on a slight rise, looking out over the gentle curve of the street and the neighboring yards. Rick stood beside her, watching the way the light pooled around them, how it caught in her hair and made her eyes glow with reflection. "You notice things, huh?" he said finally, his voice barely above the whisper of the wind. She tilted her head. "I try to," she said. "Sometimes noticing is all we can do, and it's enough." Rick thought about the multiverse, the chaos, the endless possibilities he had chased for years, and in that quiet he realized that maybe noticing, quietly, deliberately together, could matter more than any grand adventure. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in muted gold and lavender, they made their way back home. Summer's notebook bounced lightly against her hip as she walked, filled with sketches of tiny wonders she had seen along the way. Rick followed, feeling a rare stillness in his chest, the kind that didn't need to be chased or understood. That night he would think of the soft afternoon, of her quiet observation, and of the gentle way the world seemed to hold them both. And somewhere deep inside he knew that these moments, small, ordinary, and yet profound, were what he had been searching for all along. The sky had turned a deep, velvety blue, dotted with the first few stars of night. Summer sat on the porch steps, notebook resting on her lap, pencil paused in midair as she tilted her head to watch the sky. Rick leaned back in his chair beside her, mug in hand, letting the cool air settle over him. "Do you ever think about all the things that got away?" Summer asked softly. Rick didn't answer immediately. He watched a single star shimmer faintly, its light steady and patient. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but some things aren't lost. They're just waiting." She nodded as if she understood without needing more words. The night seemed to stretch outward, quiet and vast, carrying the weight of countless memories without pressing on them. Summer traced faint lines in her notebook, sketching the shapes of stars, the curve of distant clouds, the subtle folds of night itself. Each stroke was deliberate, careful, like she was holding on to something fleeting yet precious. Rick sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through him in contrast to the cool evening. He thought of rivers, skies, and the lavender light of other worlds. He thought of summers, scattered across realities, each one a faint echo of the other, and he realized that some moments, like this one, weren't about adventure or discovery. They were about presence, being here, noticing. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the soft scent of grass and distant flowers. Summer leaned back against the porch, eyes half closed, listening to the quiet hum of night. Rick followed her gaze upward, watching the stars twinkle in their slow, steady rhythm. "You think they remember us?" she asked, voice barely above the whisper of wind. Rick smiled faintly. "Maybe not," he said. "But maybe they notice. And sometimes noticing is enough." The night stretched on, soft and unbroken, carrying them gently towards sleep. Summer closed her notebook, resting her head lightly against her knees, and Rick let the silence wrap around him like a warm blanket. And somewhere, out there in the quiet universe, they felt the gentle pulse of time, steady and patient, holding them in its soft embrace. Morning arrived with a gentle hush, the sunlight diffused through thin clouds, spreading a soft warmth across the kitchen. Summer sat at the table, notebook open, pencil moving slowly, deliberately. Rick leaned against the doorway with his coffee, watching her trace faint lines that seemed to capture the weight and calm of the night before. She looked different somehow, not older, not visibly changed, but quieter, more attuned. Her observations were no longer scattered or tentative. They carried the steadiness of someone who had glimpsed something beyond themselves and held it gently. Rick didn't speak immediately. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth spread and the quiet settle around them. The scratch of pencil on paper, the faint hum of the fridge, the distant call of a bird, all of it felt magnified, yet comforting. "You seem different today," he said softly. Summer paused for a moment, looking up at him with a small, knowing smile. "I think I noticed more last night," she said simply. "Just paying attention," she added. Rick nodded. It was remarkable how much presence could change a person. He thought about the other summers scattered across realities, and how each might have lived differently, unnoticed or hurried. This one here was learning the quiet power of observation, of reflection, of holding moments gently instead of chasing them. Later they stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth, and early blooms. Summer walked slowly, notebook in hand, pausing to sketch a shadow, a leaf, the subtle curve of light across the pavement. Rick followed, silent, observing the way she carried herself, the gentle confidence of someone learning to see without trying to control. For the first time in a long while, he felt a rare stillness settle in his chest. Some moments didn't need fixing. Some people didn't need saving. Some mornings were meant only to be noticed. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling light across the yard, Rick realized that the quiet growth of this summer, her gentle awareness, her soft strength, was more extraordinary than any adventure he had ever chased. The afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen windows, warm but soft, brushing everything with a golden glow. Summer and Rick were outside now, kneeling beside a small patch of garden behind the house. Tiny shoots had begun to emerge from the soil, delicate and hopeful, and they worked slowly, gently, almost as if the plants themselves needed careful attention. Summer brushed dirt from her hands and tilted her head to watch the sun catch the leaves. Rick moved beside her, planting a small seed, pausing to notice how the earth cradled it. They didn't speak much. Their silence was a conversation of its own, a rhythm built on shared presence and quiet observation. "You think they notice us?" Summer asked softly, watching a bee hover over a flower. Rick thought about it for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Maybe not," he said, "but sometimes noticing is enough." The wind carried the faint scent of grass and flowers, a soft, calming perfume that seemed to slow time itself. Summer sketched a few lines in her notebook, capturing the curve of a leaf, the way shadows bent across the soil. Rick glanced at her work and felt the same gentle hum of wonder he had felt the night they watched the stars together. They continued quietly, moving slowly through the small garden, touching the earth, listening to the world around them. Each moment felt deliberate, full of weight, yet unburdened. Rick realized that he had spent years chasing chaos and certainty alike, but here, in this gentle rhythm, he found something neither of those could give: presence. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Summer leaned back on her heels, notebook resting in her lap. Rick followed suit, letting the warmth of the day linger across his shoulders. They watched the sky soften into muted shades of lavender and gold, the garden glowing faintly in the quiet evening light. And somewhere between the soil and the sky, the plants and the air, they understood, without saying it, that some afternoons weren't about doing. They were about noticing, together, and sometimes noticing was enough. The day had softened into evening, the sunlight now a muted gold brushing the rooftops and lawns with gentle warmth. Summer sat on the porch steps, notebook closed, hands folded in her, lap, watching the sky shift through subtle shades of lavender and rose. Rick leaned back in his chair beside her, coffee long forgotten, feeling the weight of quiet settle across his shoulders. "You ever think about how light changes everything?" Summer asked softly. Rick followed her gaze, noticing how shadows stretched and curved, how the world seemed both familiar and new. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Light and time, they do funny things." Summer tilted her head, considering. "Even small things," she added, "like the color of a leaf or the curve of a shadow, they feel different at different times." Rick nodded slowly, letting the idea linger. Sometimes noticing didn't need explanation. Sometimes it just needed space. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the faint scent of distant flowers and damp earth. The neighborhood hummed quietly, cars passing far away, birds settling in the trees. Summer traced patterns in the air with her fingers, as if following invisible lines of light. Rick watched, remembering the way she had noticed small wonders during the day, in the garden, along the paths, in her sketches. The sky darkened further, stars beginning to blink faintly into existence. Summer leaned back against the porch, letting the quiet stretch over her like a blanket. Rick followed her lead, shoulders relaxing, eyes tracing the first pinpricks of light in the sky. No words were necessary. The silence between them held understanding, patience, and gentle awe. It was the kind of quiet that could carry you through hours, maybe even days, without pressing or demanding. And somewhere between the fading light and the emerging stars, they felt the same pulse, soft, steady, patient, reminding them that presence, noticing, and quiet reflection could be just as remarkable as any adventure. The house had fallen completely quiet, the kind of quiet that hums softly in your ears, carrying shadows like whispers. Rick sat in the garage, leaning back in his chair, hands folded over his chest, eyes tracing the faint lines of light spilling from the portal machine. The hum of the machinery was comforting, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He thought about the past days, about Summer, about the quiet afternoons and evenings they had shared. Her sketches, her gentle noticing, the way she traced patterns in shadows, the way she observed without asking for more. It wasn't the kind of growth that could be measured or recorded, but he could feel it, like a soft pulse beneath the skin of the world. Rick's mind drifted, wandering through faint memories, lavender skies, rivers bending toward nowhere, small stones laid carefully along invisible paths. He realized that the multiverse he had chased for years, the chaos he had run through, the worlds he had altered and abandoned, none of it mattered the way this quiet presence did. Somewhere far away, or maybe in a dream, he imagined the other summers scattered across realities, each a faint echo of the one beside him. And for a moment, he let himself think that maybe noticing, quietly, deliberately, without words, could ripple further than any invention or adventure ever could. The night deepened and the garage felt warm despite the darkness. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the subtle creaks of the house, the faint hum of the distant city, the soft breath of life that had nothing to prove. He understood, in that stillness, that some journeys weren't about doing, or saving, or winning. They were about presence. They were about being here. And somewhere, quietly, he allowed himself a soft smile. Some things, some people, were extraordinary, simply because they existed and were noticed. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the blinds, spreading pale gold across the kitchen floor. Summer sat at the table, notebook open, pencil poised, but still. Rick leaned against the counter, mug in hand, letting the quiet stretch between them. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary in the soft glow of morning. The house held them in its gentle embrace, carrying the hum of distant life outside without intrusion. Summer's eyes traced the patterns of light on the table, following the subtle curves and shadows. Rick watched, noting the ease in her posture, the calm attention in her gaze. It was the kind of presence that didn't demand acknowledgement, but simply existed, quietly, profoundly. She lifted her pencil, drawing faint, looping shapes across the page. Rick leaned closer, seeing the gentle arcs and curves, recognizing the same rhythm he had noticed in her sketches for days. It was a rhythm that mirrored the quiet unfolding of their shared time, slow, careful, deliberate, full of subtle wonder. A soft breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying the scent of damp earth and early blooms. Rick inhaled it, letting it fill him with the same stillness that seemed to surround Summer. For a moment, the day had no demands, no urgency, no chaos. Just the quiet awareness of being here, together. Summer glanced up, eyes meeting his, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. No words were exchanged, yet everything passed between them. Understanding, presence, trust, and the faint glowing joy of noticing small wonders. Rick sipped his coffee, warmth spreading through him, and realized that some connections didn't need explanation or definition. They simply existed, steady and patient, like sunlight pouring softly across the floor. The morning carried on gently, unhurried, and somewhere in the calm, they both understood that noticing, being present, and sharing quiet moments could be as extraordinary as any adventure. The afternoon sun had softened, leaning low across the yard, casting long, warm shadows over the grass. Summer sat cross-legged near the small garden, sketchbook open, pencil moving slowly across the page. Rick leaned back in the porch, chair, arms folded, watching her work with quiet attention. A faint breeze stirred, carrying the soft scent of earth and blooming flowers. Summer paused for a moment, lifting her eyes to follow a butterfly tracing lazy circles above the plants. Rick followed her gaze, noticing the way she observed, the careful attention she gave to even the smallest movements. "You ever wonder why small things feel important sometimes?" she asked, voice barely above the whisper of wind. Rick considered. "Maybe because noticing them reminds us that the world isn't all noise and chaos," he said. Summer smiled faintly, nodding as she returned to her sketch. They moved slowly through the afternoon, tending to the garden together, arranging stones, brushing leaves, and observing the subtle rhythms of life around them. Nothing required urgency, nothing demanded action. They simply noticed, side by side, letting the quiet fill the spaces between their movements. The light shifted gradually, softening further as the sun approached the horizon. Shadows deepened, colours muted, and the garden seemed to glow with a gentle warmth. Summer closed her sketchbook and leaned back, hands resting lightly on the ground. Rick remained in his chair, watching the sky and the way the evening touched everything with calm patience. Somewhere between soil and sky, between the fading sunlight and the emerging night, they felt the same pulse, soft, steady, patient. It reminded them that some moments, quiet, unhurried, shared, were as extraordinary as any grand adventure. And as the day folded into evening, they simply sat together, noticing, breathing, being. Night had settled completely, stretching across the world like a soft, dark blanket. Summer lay on the porch steps, eyes closed, notebook resting against her chest. Rick sat beside her, leaning back, hands resting on his knees, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house, the faint hum of the universe just beyond the walls. The stars were bright tonight, scattered across the sky like gentle sparks of memory. Rick watched them blink, each one steady, patient, holding their light quietly without demand. He thought of the days behind them, mornings soft with sunlight, afternoons full of quiet noticing, evenings stretched with gentle reflection. Each moment had been ordinary, yet extraordinary in the way only presence could make ordinary things feel. Summer shifted slightly, breathing slow and even, her pencil tucked into the notebook like a small, waiting thought. Rick looked at her, letting the calm of her sleep fill him with warmth. Somewhere in the quiet he realized that life, with all its chaos and noise, was held together by small moments like these, the act of noticing, of being present, of caring quietly. The wind stirred faintly, carrying the faint scent of flowers and distant rain. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, letting it carry him into reflection. Memories of lavender skies, rivers bending into nowhere, tiny stones arranged carefully along invisible paths. He thought of summers in other worlds, of stars, of laughter, and the faint pulse of life that moved steadily beneath it all. And somewhere in the stillness, he understood. Love, connection, quiet attention. These were the truest adventures, the ones you couldn't chase or control, the ones you simply noticed, held, and let bloom. Rick shifted, letting himself exhale softly, feeling the day dissolve gently into night. Summer slept on beside him, the notebook closed, the soft hum of her presence as steady as the stars above. He smiled faintly, the quiet settling around him like a lullaby, and with that, he stretched into the stars.